Hello, and welcome to our SD38 Numeracy Inclusive Practices in Mathematics in the Middle Years, grades 6 to 9 series. This particular session is on collaborative learning, where we are talking about specific practices that can create access for all learners. We're anchoring some of our thinking on the text that you see on the side that are around UDL and mathematics. And today we're going to be exploring some ideas that come through the text that you see on the right, which are around collaborative math classrooms. We're also considering, as we engage in collaborative learning, how are we going to support all learners? What strategies might they need, and what tools would help them, sort through and manage their learning. When we are considering inclusive practices in mathematics, we are considering the framework of UDL. We want to always consider who our learners are and the variability that exists within them and between them. We want to think about their specific identities, the barriers that they may have to learning, and then we might want to plan in advance to provide tools and strategies that can invite them into the learning as we design learning, language, and social goals. When we are practicing some of the principles of UDL, we're always considering how we can create student engagement. That means also making connections to the diversity of identities and funds of knowledge that students bring in the classroom. But it also means that we are providing options and choices for how students engage in the learning and how they express their learning. Today, we're going to be focusing on collaborative learning. We'll think about what it is, consider some of the benefits of engaging in these practices in your classroom. We'll talk about what parts of a lesson students can be collaborating with one another and connecting on learning, and then what particular supports might be useful. So this is a quote from the text that you see at the bottom of the screen on the right. It says, "The study of human learning and development is clear. Learning is a social endeavor. We have long known that we learn by exploring and reflecting on our world and with one another." That one was by Dewey. "And people learn through interactions with our environment, with one another, and in this case, with the discipline of mathematics." What that is saying is that learning is social, and it requires students to engage in discourse, academic discourse, in order for them to listen, actively make connections, start to think about how they can apply learning or even those deeper orders of thinking as they are engaging in particular tasks. Collaborative learning really emphasizes this type of dialogue that is rooted in building mathematics habits of the mind. So as we're exploring our big ideas around math and engaging in learning experiences that give us deeper understanding of concepts and content, we want to think about how we can create opportunities for students to engage in these types of learning that are investigative and exploratory. We also want to consider some other forms of collaboration that exist that may not have the same sorts of impacts, things like cooperative learning. Cooperative learning is another instructional strategy whereby students work alongside each other to complete a task. It's product-oriented, and there's a lot of parallel work that's happening at the same time there that doesn't necessarily align with some of the bigger thinking around collaborative learning, where the intention is for students to form ideas together, to be able to determine solutions, share their thinking, and explain and justify as they are going through a process of learning. When we do these sorts of things, we're nurturing thinkers and doers of math, creating greater engagement, more robust learning, deeper connections. Students are engaging in core competencies and mathematical habits of the mind, while we are cultivating community and valuing the diversity and equity in our classes. So collaborative learning can happen during all three parts of this lesson structure. This is a typical lesson structure that we might have in our classrooms, although there are so many varied lesson styles. But we can invite collaborative learning to happen at each one of these. As the warm-up before the learning happens, during, which takes the bulk of the time, where we go deeper with our thinking, and then at the end when we're reflecting and consolidating. What we want to think about is what is the role of the teacher and the students during this collaborative process. So in order for us to kind of get going with collaborative learning in our classroom, or to offer more opportunities for it, we might want to think about how we can create spaces in which this can happen. So how do we consider our learning environment, what's required for peer-to-peer interactions, and how are we going to make connections to math that are meaningful? So in a learning environment, we want to consider the physical setup in the room that enables students to collaborate with ease. So when they are engaging in the learning, that they can access all the materials that they require, that is available for choice, that they are facing one another, and able to work on either tabletops or around the room in different areas to explore math. We want to also consider how we make it explicit and transparent what the role is for students. And we want to understand what the relationships are with students themselves. This is going to help us when we design our groupings and or decide if they're going to be randomized. But we also want to consider how we're building community connections and are nurturing that sense of belonging. So when we learn with others, we may want to consider how we plan our groups and support collaboration. When planning in your groups, you want to think about how we can build in opportunities for students to work in these small groups, because they're more likely to take risks, ask questions, face challenges, and persevere when they're working with peers than when they're invited to do so in large group settings, like a whole group instruction period. There's lots of different ways in which groups for instruction can happen, and this flexible grouping can meet different needs of students. But what we want to consider is how students can communicate with one another, or how we might want to put students together for practical reasons, like it's easier or necessary to share manipulatives. But we might want to consider some of the questions that are on the screen. What is the purpose of the learning experience, and how might group learning amplify or hinder this intention? What student connections might be beneficial to the learning or to moving towards other goals? And what group size could support the progression of learning efficiently? And how long might groups require for the activity to be constructive and productive, right? So really thinking about creating those times, those spaces, and those opportunities for students, while we are explicitly teaching how to collaborate. Students need strategies. They need strategies for how to listen to one another, how to share ideas, how to consolidate some of that thinking or synthesize some of that thinking, how to present, particularly for solutions, how to justify their thinking also. And then in those strategies, are there any tools that could be useful to them so that they could do, or it could inform them about how to actively engage in those those processes. So things like discussion prompts, things like vocabulary lists, graphic organizers, and sentence stems would be very helpful. When we're engaging in math learning with these productive collaborations, we want to consider how often we are providing students with opportunity to learn with one another, and how often we are providing independent learning time, and when we are providing some direct instruction with gradual release. There's a balance to it all, and there's no magic around that. It's really about you kind of understanding what's needed for your students. But we know that if there are greater gains when students are able to talk with one another, creating more opportunities for collaboration is going to be beneficial. So we can do that in the warm-up or the beginning part of a lesson with instructional routines that are less than 20 minutes. But we want to emphasize when it is that peers are going to be interacting with one another, right? So when we're doing math talks, we might pose a question and provide opportunity for students to think independently, but then to share learning with an elbow partner, and then to do a larger share out. We also want to consider which instructional routines lend itself to this type of conversation. There are some listed on the screen here that might apply to many topics that you're engaging in. But the question types that we pose during these types of routines are important to design so that we are inviting students into the learning. So open-ended questions that encourage mental math, that where there could be multiple solution strategies, that encourage discussion, require students to explain and justify, and for them to vary their task types. So these are some examples of sentence frames that we can use, and or some like there are also instructional routines, or have become instructional routines, because they do provide for that open-ended type of learning. Here are some examples. If I have an example that says evaluate, and I give an expression like that with rational numbers, I might turn it into something that's more open by using one of the sentence frames previously, like the most common mistake you might see in this problem is, right? Also consider what the teacher's role is during this time, right? Is it to guide the learning at some points, but it's really to observe and to record and to stretch thinking, but also an opportunity to encourage students to practice using vocabulary and discourse, language, but and sentence frames that you might provide. Here's another example. What's the easiest way to determine the surface area of the following object, rather than determine it? Whenever we are using instructional routines, make sure that they align with your learning intentions, that there's a structure and flow for both teachers and students so that they know what the routine is. Create some access points for students. I'm going to show you what that might look like. And how we might address variability during those routines, and also how we highlight math vocabulary and language that we want students to use as they are sharing. So here's an example of those particular types of supports. We might have students pull out their glossary of terms. I might also put a list of vocabulary on the board that we're encouraging students to use, the sentence frames that are there, some materials that they have a choice for using during that time while they are engaging in this task. Another place where students could work collaboratively to engage in productive learning is anything to do with inquiry. So problem and challenge-based inquiry are great opportunities for doing that. There's a couple examples on this screen where students could be exploring, different ways of approaching solutions to bigger questions that align with how they might apply math in the real world. One thing that I'm seeing a lot in classrooms these days, and seeing huge impacts, is students working on vertical non-permanent spaces to collaboratively in groups of 3 to find solutions to problems that are open-ended. These are low floor, high ceiling questions that are contextualized. They range in acceptable solutions, and they require students to explain and justify their thinking. These are sometimes called numeracy tasks, offered by Peter Liljedahl, as we see on the screen. If you want to know more about how to run a building thinking classroom, that's his book on the screen there. Here are some resources that you might look to if you want to grab some of those open-ended questions that could be explored on those vertical non-permanent spaces. What is interesting about this type of learning is that there are some structures that you need to prepare students with so that they know how to do this independently. For example, one student would be the scriber, one student would be the person that asks questions, one person is the communicator to the large group. And, then you switch roles every so often within the group so that everyone has an opportunity to practice in each of those roles. Math Workshop is another example in which collaborative learning is very effective. It's an opportunity for students to engage in, learning that you might have already done in class and want to reinforce or apply in different ways. But it's time to grapple with the ideas in really rich ways. And the reason why Math Workshop is so lovely is that it focuses on students doing most of the math. They make the choices. They get really enthusiastic when they're working with each other in time frames. They know the structure, and so they know when they're moving on to the next station. And the teacher is just facilitating and monitoring and maybe offering themselves to be in other groups for small group work. This is an example of a math stations activity for Math Facts, where I know the curricular goals are there. I've got some language goals around use of vocabulary, and we're providing options for students to choose and have autonomy. So here's what an example could look like, where we've got 5 stations, and I'm providing tools at each of the stations that can provide access to the learning. In addition to that, I'm really thinking about the content that I'm providing at each of the stations and differentiating it so that students could choose the just right question for them. And I'm also thinking about how I might, during math stations, create a small group for instruction, and so that students can show you some of the particular types of thinking and understandings that they have using the proficiency indicators that you have, and being able to ask the guiding questions that support students in showing you or representing what they know. One other example that you might think of doing to encourage collaboration in a different way is Chalk Talk. It's actually an independent, quiet activity for most of the time, but what is the power of this is the consolidation of thinking component, right? So in a Chalk Talk, either on chalk paper or on the vertical non-permanent spaces, you can put a question or a quote. Students are in small groups, and then they respond independently or add to other people's thinking. And this gives them an opportunity to, slowly witness, process, and add to learning, and then talk about what kinds of learning have happened during that time. And our role during that is to support them in those conversations. So the types of questions that you pose to learners are really important to consider depending on what you want them to demonstrate. And so you want to encourage deep thinking during this collaborative learning. At the end of any collaboration, we want to provide students with an opportunity to think independently so that they can consolidate some of that thinking and reflect on their own to make those connections that they need so that they can make sense of the learning. So we want to, as we are going and circulating around the room, think about, whom we might select to be able to do some of the whole group sharing so that we can, provide those key ideas that you want students to leave with. And then we want to provide opportunities for them to have some independent student reflection time. These are some prompts for types of questions that we can ask for student reflection. If you would like some more resources on inclusive practices in mathematics, you can go to our RichNet page. There are a number of apps at the bottom, or of the number of tiles, sorry, at the bottom of the page where you can click and find more information for each grade group. As you move forward with your practice and consider how you might incorporate collaborative learning, think about how the collaborative learning will amplify the learning goals you've identified, what student connections might be beneficial to the learning or to move towards other goals, what group size could support the progression of learning efficiently, how long might groups require to be in these activities for, and what supports and strategies might students need to collaborate effectively. Thank you.